From technical errors to bad driving, to drivers being just mean and nasty, here are some of the FIA's most controversial fines and punishments in F1 history. At the top of this list is Michael Schumacher because of his 2 accidents in Monaco. The first one was in 2006 when he hit the barrier at Raskas and slowed down during qualifying, which caused the yellow flags to come out and stop the drivers, including Fernando Alonso, from beating their best time. But after the session, the stewards decided that Schumacher had purposely parked the car to change the results.
I'm pretty busy with driving my car. I had certainly no radio communication. No, not at all. I didn't know.
And they took away his stoppage times and put him at the back of the grid. But even though justice had been served, it was controversial in less obvious ways than other things. The main point of disagreement was that a challenger for the title had been punished too harshly. And not just any competitor, it was the best driver in the sport's history. As for the second incident, it happened 4 years later when he was making a comeback with Mercedes. On the last lap, as the safety car went into the pits, Schumacher sped past Alonso and Anthony Newis. After Ferrari's appeal, Schumacher was given a 20-second penalty and moved down to 12th place. A classic case of intent versus interpretation of the rules, which could be taken to say that passing isn't allowed on the last lap if the safety car is out, but it is allowed once the safety car is in the pits. But this wasn't as absurd as Tyrrell's exclusion. 1984 saw Tyrrell being the only team with a naturally aspirated engine, while all of its competitors used turbochargers instead. During the races, people saw lead shots from the top of the cars. And when the FIA looked into it, they found that the car's tanks were being filled with 2 gallons of water and 140 pounds of lead shot. Excuse me, what? As a result, they were charged with using illegal fuel lines, and illegally installed ballast. And after being banned from the last 3 races, the team was kicked out of the World Championship and lost its chance to win. Yes, the punishment was harsh, but that wasn't the only reason this was controversial. You see, before turbos were used, other teams like Brabham and Williams had found a clever but sneaky way to make the minimum weight. The car passed the weight test by being filled with water. And this was done because the brakes were cooled by water.
People, clever designers conceived a system that when the car leaves the pits, it's dropped down by means of a...
You're probably wondering how they managed to do that. Well, even though the water was dumped out of the car during the race, it was filled back up with water and weighted again at the end. And by the letter of the law, this was acceptable because it was original car fluids. That's one memorable loophole. But too bad it was pretty costly. Speaking of costly, how can I not mention Senna's Suzuka exclusion in 1989? You see, to retain his world title, Senna needed to pass the championship leader. And he did this by not braking enough for the last chicane and driving to the inside. But in a surprising move, Prost turned in. Alessandro Nannini passed both of them, and Prost was out on the spot. Senna got help from a marshal and went back in the race with a broken nose. He pits to get a new car, but somehow he manages to catch the Benetton, beat it, and win, which, in theory, gives him the title. But after the race, the FIA disqualified him for not returning to the track where he had left it.
He had, in my opinion, 2 very bad ones in 89 and 1990, and they were a consequence of...
You see, Senna had cut through the chicane after being pushed in that direction by the marshals. And technically, this made Prost the winner. But the question is, why did a world title have to depend on a decision like this? Well, that's because the FIA said before the race that drivers had to get back on the track where they left it. But Senna and his competitors said it was dangerous to turn around and rejoin when a field of F1 cars entered a hard braking zone. But people also pointed at Jean-Marie Ballester, the president of the FIA at the time, and from the same country as the eventual winner. But who am I to judge? You make up your own mind. But even when the teams sometimes do the right thing, huge punishments are always controversial. And yes, I'm talking about Renault's Crashgate ban. Flavio Briatore, the managing director of Renault F1, and Pat Simmons, the director of engineering, were banned for life after they set up Nelson Piquet Jr.'s crash in Singapore to change the outcome of the race. I've also added this to the list because of how the bans were later lifted. You see, any kind of cheating needs to be punished harshly. And at first, it seemed like the FIA had done just that. But after each party filed a complaint, the bans were lifted and the two were compensated. Then, surprisingly, the FIA appealed the result of the appeal. And it was finally solved when Simmons and Briatore agreed that neither of them would work in Formula One again until that season. Damn, this was wild! Do you know what else this reminds me of? Testgate 2013. When Pirelli and Mercedes stayed in the F1 paddock after the 2013 Spanish Grand Prix, other teams probably should have asked why. You see, Mercedes was already helping Pirelli test tires to look at options for 2014. But it turned out that options for 2013 were also looked at. This, along with the drivers wearing helmets without any markings, made a huge stink with the other teams, who called Mercedes cheaters and said Pirelli was out to get everyone else. F1 is surely a very unpredictable business. Pirelli and Mercedes were told to do better, while Mercedes was also not allowed to take the Silverstone Young Driver test. Does it sound too harsh? No, not really. But they did not get to test the new tires that Pirelli would put out in the middle of the 2013 season. Ultimately, the ruling that was made was too easy on the person. And a lot of people agree that Mercedes got off really easy. Moving on to Michael Schumacher. Welcome back to the list. If you change the list to the Formula One World Championship, you'll have the FIA's decision on the controversial crash between Michael Schumacher and Jacques Villeneuve in 1997. Even though Schumacher tried to change the result by cheating as he crashed into Villeneuve, who was leading the championship, the FIA decided that removing him from the championship standings but keeping his points and statistics was enough of a punishment. People talked about banning him in 1998, but the FIA was like, no way. They said it was okay because it wouldn't stop people from doing bad things. And if Schumacher had won the world title in 1997, he would have been happy to sit out the next year. But I think this list would be incomplete without the McLaren Spygate scandal that made both the team and the sport look bad. McLaren was found guilty of stealing confidential information from rivals Ferrari, and the sport's punishment was the biggest ever seen. They lost all of their constructors' points and had to finish last in the championship. This meant that they didn't get any prize money. To add to their financial troubles, they were hit with a £50 million fine, which was more like a roundhouse kick to the face than a slap. The severity of the punishment and the size of the fine makes this the worst thing that has ever happened in F1. And when you add in the rocky Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, where Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso's rivalry came to a head, as the drivers blocked each other in qualifying, and the team was fined and lost points for that, 2007 was surely a terrible year for McLaren. And that's a wrap.